Welcome to the debate. So imagine spending, $50 million in 3 years painstakingly upgrading your enterprise architecture. And then suddenly your entire global supply chain is brought to a dead halt because a single country changed its XML invoicing format overnight.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is a terribly real, high-stakes scenario.
Right, it really is. Today, we are arguing about the architecture of survival. We're looking at a digital landscape that is fundamentally volatile, where regulatory bodies are, knocking on the front door, demanding you rip out the plumbing of your business while the building is still fully occupied.
Yeah, and that extreme volatility is exactly what brings us here today. We're exploring the architectural strategy for SAP compliance integration in global enterprises. We're drawing directly from recent frameworks that address compliance scalability, and specifically, that massive gap between merely surviving a go-live date, what we might call operational success, and actually achieving long-term strategic value.
Exactly. The central question we are debating is this. When adapting SAP systems to a rapidly changing global regulatory environment, should organizations strictly adopt a separated 3-layer clean core architecture to achieve that long-term strategic value? Or does this demand for absolute architectural abstraction and, future-proofing introduce an overwhelming upfront complexity that completely ignores operational realities?
It's a huge question.
It is. I'm taking the position that a strict 3-layer architecture and a forward-looking clean core are absolutely mandatory. Without them, you are inevitably going to face an unmanageable maintenance crisis as these global compliance mandates scale up.
And my position is that while conceptually elegant, treating all point-to-point integration as a catastrophic failure and mandating complete architectural abstraction often over-engineers the solution. I argue that this approach simply shifts your technical debt to external platforms rather than actually eliminating it.
All right, well, let's start by looking at the mechanics of the baseline problem we're trying to solve. The traditional legacy approach to SAP compliance is point-to-point integration. A new mandate drops, say, a new e-invoicing requirement in a specific country.
Right, the usual fire drill.
Exactly. The natural panicked reaction is to build a direct connection. SAP extracts the data, transforms it, and submits it for that specific mandate. And for a single jurisdiction, that's a perfectly rational response. But if you replicate that across 20, 30, or 50 jurisdictions over a decade, it becomes architecturally catastrophic.
Right, because your maintenance surface area expands exponentially. Every single new connection is a new point of failure.
Precisely. And it's because compliance mandates have 3 compounding variables. First, you have the data structure, which specific fields the government requires. Second, you have the format, like the specific XML schemas or business document standards they demand. And third, the communication protocol. The API endpoints and the response handling. In a point-to-point setup, all 3 of those dimensions are tangled together into one monolithic unit of custom software. So when a mandate changes, that entire customized unit has to be retested and updated.
Which takes massive amounts of time.
Right, so achieving true strategic value requires decoupling those variables into 3 distinct layers. Layer 1 is the SAP integration point, Layer 2 is compliance orchestration, and Layer 3 is authority connectivity. This separation is the only way we ensure the SAP core remains pristine and insulated from continuous regulatory velocity.
I come at it from a different way. I fully acknowledge that building 50 separate point-to-point integrations creates an incredibly fragile maintenance surface. Nobody wants to manage 50 customized extraction and transformation engines inside SAP.
No, they definitely don't.
Right, but the proposed alternative, this perfectly decoupled, isolated 3-layer architecture you're describing, relies on an architectural utopia that rarely survives contact with reality.
I don't see it as a utopia at all. I see it as a necessary structural boundary. If you don't enforce that boundary, the ERP core degrades.
But the boundary itself is flawed from the start. Take the very foundation of this theory, Layer 1, the canonical data model. The core idea here is that you define a universal, standardized representation of financial transactions that perfectly anticipates all future regulatory needs.
Yes, exactly.
I argue that creating a canonical model that successfully anticipates the quirks of all future global mandates is nearly impossible. And furthermore, moving the regulatory complexity to an external compliance orchestration platform in Layer 2 doesn't actually eliminate your programming backlog, it simply displaces the complexity.
How so?
Well, you are moving the burden from SAP ABAP developers, the people writing proprietary code directly inside SAP, over to external configuration specialists. Meanwhile, you dramatically overburden the initial blueprint phase with theoretical future-proofing. You are shifting the technical debt, you're not erasing it.
Okay, let's examine that foundation closely. Because you're right, if the data extraction in Layer 1 isn't truly agnostic, the entire three-layer philosophy collapses. Layer 1 must serve a single consistent purpose, which is extracting canonical financial data.
Right, the baseline info.
Exactly. We're talking about standard billing documents, purchase orders, FI postings. And you extract this using standard technologies like SAP Integration Suite or EDI docs. Crucially, there is zero compliance logic happening here, no tax determination, no regulatory formatting.
Okay,
To visualize how these three layers interact, think of a large-scale restaurant kitchen. Layer 1 is simply the pantry. The pantry only holds raw, standard ingredients, your baseline financial data. It doesn't know what recipe is being cooked. It just hands over the flour and the eggs,
that's a fun way to picture it.
right? SAP simply hands over the canonical data, regardless of whether it's destined for the tax authorities of Brazil, France, or India.
The restaurant kitchen metaphor is helpful, but, well, tax authorities are not asking for standard recipes. Every new continuous transaction control, or CTC mandate, introduces highly novel data requirements.
Sure, mandates change.
Yeah, they change drastically. Let's say you built your pantry based on a pristine canonical model of standard financial fields. 2 years later, a new jurisdiction implements a mandate requiring a highly specific logistical data point. Maybe they want the transporter's license plate number or a deeply specific environmental tax classification on a subcomponent of a product.
Which would be stored natively in SCP anyway.
Yes, it is stored in SAP, but it's not in your original canonical extraction because no one anticipated a tax authority wanting it. The ingredient isn't in the pantry. So what happens mechanically?
You add it.
Right, but your architects are forced to go back into Layer 1, open up the SAP integration point, and map those new fields into the extraction logic. You are writing new logic and updating SAP anyway. The promise that SAP is completely insulated from regulatory change is broken the moment a tax authority demands a data point outside your perfectly conceived canonical model.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective. Updating the canonical data extraction to include a new field is fundamentally different from updating custom compliance logic.
Is it though?
Yes, absolutely. When you add that transporter's license plate to the canonical data model, you are simply enriching the standard extraction for the entire global architecture. You are expanding the pantry. You are not writing a custom ABAP rule inside SAP that says, if country equals France, then format the license plate exactly like this. But if country equals Italy, omit it entirely.
Okay, fair point.
You were just passing the raw data point outward. The actual regulatory formatting, the true heavy complexity lives downstream in Layer 2, the compliance orchestration layer.
But does it really matter mechanically where the complexity lives if the maintenance burden remains identical for the IT team? If you are an enterprise architect listening to this, you're probably rolling your eyes right now, thinking, I've heard this canonical data promise a dozen times before, and it always results in a massive mapping exercise.
It matters immensely because of where the bottlenecks form during an upgrade cycle. Layer 2 is where regulatory velocity is actively managed. Think of Layer 2 as the line cooks in our restaurant kitchen.
Back to the kitchen.
Always back to the kitchen. They take the raw ingredients from the pantry and apply the highly specific regional recipes. This is where country-specific VAD determination rules, XML transformations, and validation checks actually happen. By using a configurable compliance orchestration platform, updates to specific schemas are handled via configuration rather than custom code.
Okay, but
Let me just give an example. Let's look at Italy's SDI.
That's their centralized government clearinghouse that must validate every single invoice before it's legally recognized. When Italy updates its SDI schema, SAP is completely untouched. The Layer 1 integration is untouched. You simply update the configuration rule in that external orchestration platform.
And why couldn't you just do that in SAP Integration Suite?
Because iFlows in the SAP Integration Suite aren't designed to hold massive matrices of tax determination logic. An iFlow is essentially a pipeline. It takes data from point A, maybe maps a few fields, and delivers it to point B. It's fantastic for standard system integration.
Right.
But the moment you try to embed 50 different country-specific VAT rules into integration middleware, you've created an unmanageable spider web of routing rules. If you try to build Layer 2 logic using country-specific iFlows, you are just recreating the point-to-point problem in a cloud environment. You need a dedicated external orchestration engine specifically built for compliance matrices.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. The distinction you are making between configuration in an external compliance engine and custom code in SAP is purely semantic in the real world. Have you looked at the configuration interfaces of these massive compliance platforms?
Of course I have.
Then you know configuration at a global scale is just coding by another name. If you need a 500-page manual to understand your drop-down menus and routing matrices, you haven't eliminated technical debt. You've just given it a new user interface.
I would argue a standardized UI dedicated to compliance is vastly superior to thousands of lines of bespoke ABAP code scattered across an ERP system like confetti.
Sure, but you are still managing highly divergent VAT determination rules, complex format transformations, and real-time validations across 50 different jurisdictions. Doing that on an external platform is phenomenally complex.
Well, compliance is complex.
Exactly. Take Poland's KSEF e-invoicing system. The rules for how an invoice is formulated and validated are incredibly rigid. When the rules for KSEF change, managing that change in an external platform requires a highly specialized permanent maintenance effort. You are still paying architects and developers to manage it. They just have a different job title now.
But their work is isolated.
A deeply nested configuration matrix that routes hundreds of different entity combinations into specific XML nodes is virtually indistinguishable from custom code in terms of the technical debt it creates. You haven't erased the complexity of Italy's SDI or Poland's KSEF. You've just rented an external house to store that complexity in.
Renting that external house is exactly what allows the SAP implementation to survive its own lifecycle. Operational success is getting the system to work on day one, but strategic value, which is what the source material emphasizes, is the ability to absorb a wave of regulatory changes 3 years later without freezing your entire ERP upgrade cycle.
Okay, I see the value in that.
Right, because if you have custom tax logic baked into your SAP core, every time SAP releases an update, you have to regression test thousands of lines of bespoke code just to make sure you can still issue a legal invoice in Poland. By moving that to Layer 2, you decouple the upgrade paths.
I agree that keeping the core clean facilitates ERP upgrades. That is a tangible benefit. But the theoretical separation of logic leads directly to the operational reality of submitting the data. And that brings us to Layer 3.
The connectivity layer.
Exactly. So even if we grant that Layer 2 perfectly isolates the ERP from changing tax logic, it still has to talk to the real world. A perfect internal algorithm means nothing if the Brazilian tax authority's server goes down right when you try to submit it. How does this architecture handle the actual network reality?
That is exactly what Layer 3 authority connectivity is built for. Going back to our restaurant, Layer 3 is the waitstaff. They have to navigate the chaotic dining room, deliver the food to the specific tables, and handle it if a customer rejects a dish.
Let's drop the restaurant for a second.
Fair enough. Mechanically, Layer 3 handles the API calls, the cryptographic authentication, and the response processing with the various tax authority platforms. You absolutely have to design this layer for the real world because, well, the real world is messy. It needs intelligent retry logic for when authority platforms experience transient outages. It needs circuit breakers.
Let's define what you mean by a circuit breaker in this context, because that's crucial.
Sure, a circuit breaker prevents your system from self-destructing during an external outage. If a government server in Spain is running incredibly slow, You don't want your ERP system to overwhelm it with a submission storm of 100,000 invoices. That would cause timeouts across your entire network.
Right.
The circuit breaker trips, pauses the submissions, and queues them until the authority platform is healthy again. Crucially, Layer 3 needs to provide real-time visibility into submission status, platform health, and compliance coverage. This is operational visibility that traditional SAP monitoring simply does not provide. It has to be designed natively into the blueprint.
And this is exactly where the inherent tension in your architecture becomes glaringly obvious. Let's look at the operational reality of that real-time feedback. In a continuous transaction control environment, a tax authority isn't just a passive Dropbox receiving data.
No, they're not.
Right, they are actively approving or rejecting your business transactions in real time. If Layer 3 manages those transient outages, and more importantly, receives rejected submissions, what happens next?
The error handling workflow is triggered in the orchestration layer. The configuration platform figures out what went wrong with the recipe.
But it can't stop there. That error handling workflow inevitably has to communicate back to the pantry, back to SAP. Imagine a truck is sitting at the loading dock in São Paulo. The invoice data goes through your perfect 3 layers, hits the Brazilian tax authority, and gets rejected because of an invalid buyer VAT number.
That happens all the time.
Exactly. And that truck legally cannot leave the dock until the invoice is approved. You cannot just log that failure in Layer 3 and call it a day. SAP needs to know immediately. The outbound delivery in SAP must be blocked. The financial posting might need to be reversed or flagged.
Sure, the status is updated.
But the document status inside SAP must be updated to reflect the compliance failure so the warehouse manager knows not to open the loading dock doors. So your Layer 3 connectivity is reaching right back into your supposedly clean core to manipulate document statuses. The tight feedback loop required by CTC environments fundamentally undermines the pristine isolation you are advocating for.
I completely disagree with that characterization. Updating a document status flag via a standard API return is not the same as embedding compliance logic in the core.
It's still an external rule dictating an internal state.
But the logic of why it was rejected remains completely outside. SAP just receives a standardized message like document rejected, reason code 402. SAP doesn't need to understand the nuances of the Brazilian tax code to process that standard return message. It just needs to know that reason code 402 means block the delivery.
But the SAP workflow has to be explicitly configured to respond to reason code 402 in a specific way, which means the functional consultants building SAP are still intimately tied to the regulatory reality of the tax authorities. The outside world is dictating internal SAP workflows. And that brings us to the organizational impact and specifically the massive burden this philosophy places on the blueprint phase of an implementation.
Which is exactly why this conversation needs to happen at the very beginning of a project. The integration architecture between SAP and the compliance world is not just a technical detail left for the integration workstream to figure out a month before testing. It is a fundamental, strategic governance decision.
A very expensive one.
Yes, but to build this 3-layer architecture correctly, an implementation program must include a 3-year forward-looking regulatory horizon assessment during the initial blueprint phase. You cannot just design your canonical data model for the mandates that exist today. You have to bring in indirect tax leaders, treasury, and compliance technology specialists early.
That's a huge undertaking.
It is. But you have to ensure the document structures and master data configurations are CTC ready from the beginning. You have to ensure the system produces AI-ready, machine-readable output from day one, so that you aren't scrambling when predictive analytics become a requirement. That requires immense discipline.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the paralysis this induces in a massive enterprise project? You are forcing SAP implementation teams to anticipate 36 months of global regulatory shifts. You're asking them to map out every potential CTC mandate on the horizon across 50 different sovereign legislatures and to design data models for undefined future AI initiatives.
It's risk mitigation.
But if you demand that level of foresight, you risk never actually reaching go-live.
But if you don't design for the horizon, your go-live is just the beginning of a relentless, painful remediation cycle. You celebrate the launch on Monday, and on Tuesday, you're opening IT tickets to fix non-compliant workflows.
I'm not advocating for negligence here, but over-indexing on this long-term strategic value jeopardizes the immediate requirement of operational success. A system that is perfectly designed to handle the regulatory landscape of 2029, but misses its 2026 deployment deadline because the blueprint phase dragged on for an extra year, is a failure.
That's an extreme scenario.
Is it? You are asking implementation teams to predict the behavior of governments. Governments change. Tax authorities delay mandates, or worse, they completely rewrite them at the 11th hour. If you build an incredibly rigid, heavily engineered 3-layer architecture based on a 3-year forecast, you might find you've built the perfect system for a world that never materialized.
That is exactly why the architecture must be strictly separated into those 3 layers. The architecture itself absorbs that unpredictability. If a government rewrites a mandate at the 11th hour, you aren't scrambling to rewrite SAP core logic. You are simply adjusting the configuration in layer 2. The flexibility is built into the orchestration layer.
Assuming the data's there?
Exactly. To summarize my position on this, the upfront blueprinting, the early stakeholder alignment, and the strict layer separation absolutely demand immense discipline. It is hard work, but it is the only sustainable defense against the compounding maintenance crisis of global compliance. By treating the integration point, the orchestration, and the connectivity as truly independent layers, we ensure the ERP system actually delivers strategic value over its life cycle, rather than just surviving its first day in production.
And to summarize my perspective, while architectural flexibility is undeniably paramount, dogmatically pursuing a perfect canonical abstraction and anticipating a 3-year regulatory horizon can trap enterprises in endless planning loops. By mandating a universal data model and pushing all logic to external orchestration engines, we often just shift the technical debt to different platforms and different teams. Configuration is often just coding by another name, and the tight feedback loops required by modern tax authorities ensure that the ERP core is never truly isolated from the real world.
Well, I think where we absolutely converge, based on the source material we've been examining, is that the old ways are dead. Traditional point-to-point architectures built solely to survive a go-live date with custom ABAP code for every country are no longer viable for a global enterprise. The maintenance math simply does not work anymore.
I fully agree with that. No one is arguing for a return to 50 custom integrations inside SAP. And we also agree that SAP Integration Suite alone cannot serve as the entire compliance orchestration layer. Using iFlows to hard-code country-specific tax matrices is just putting a modern cloud wrapper on a legacy point-to-point mistake. You fundamentally need dedicated compliance orchestration capabilities to handle the sheer volume of rules.
It really highlights how the tension between immediate operational delivery and long-term architectural purity is a fundamental, inescapable challenge in enterprise technology. You cannot ignore either side of the equation.
Definitely not.
The source material offers further, highly detailed blueprints for building that operational visibility and resilience, particularly around how circuit breakers and standard error codes function. I'd highly recommend our listeners explore it to see the mechanics of these layers in practice.
Ultimately, every enterprise has to evaluate which architectural philosophy best suits their own regulatory footprint, their risk tolerance, and their organizational maturity. A company operating in 3 stable European countries has a very different calculus than a company operating in 50 highly volatile jurisdictions. There is no one-size-fits-all answer.
Which brings us back to the reality of the foundation. The digital ground is going to keep shifting beneath us. The regulatory codes are going to keep changing. The central question for architects is whether you try to build a system so perfectly abstracted that it theoretically never has to change, or whether you accept that at some point, despite your best designs, you are going to have to get your hands dirty and adjust the plumbing. Thank you for joining us on the debate.